Thank you so much. It is my pleasure to be here. I do travel all over the country. Last year, I did 265 meetings in 22 states. And this is a mission that my family and I have taken up as a defense of the Constitution. I believe that I'm a missionary to the people of the United States in defense of the Constitution. This is our life, our fortune, our sacred honor. And I am doing this because I want my child to have liberty that I'm supposed to have. And I don't want him to have to pick up a musket to get it. But if we don't figure out what's going on in this country and start turning this thing around and educating our children on the truth, then we are headed down a road of no return. Now, what I do when I travel is I teach people things that they haven't been taught for decades. Things that we have been taught wrong about the Constitution, and the entire purpose of that is to undermine the authority of the Constitution so that we can all agree that the Constitution is antiquated, it's outdated, it's irrelevant. And since we're so technologically advanced today, we all know that we're intellectually advanced, and we have to go in and reinvent what the framers of our nation wanted us to know. Go ahead, you can laugh at that. So what I'm going to start off, because I'm going to talk to you today about religious liberty. Because if we don't understand religious liberty, then we don't understand the role of religion in politics. And it's another one of those things that we have been taught wrong for such a very long time. So I know you didn't know this, but I'm about to give you some pop quizzes. Are you ready? And don't be shy, just shout out. What year did women get the right to vote in America?
1920.
1920. Well, that's what we are taught, but that's not true. You're referring to the women's suffrage movement and the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The truth of the matter is, women have always had the right to vote in America. There is nothing in the Constitution that ever prevented women from voting. And as a matter of fact, women voted in this country until 1807, when corrupt politicians on the state level started monkeying with who could vote and who couldn't vote, not just women, to consolidate power unto themselves. Who was the first man to die in the Revolutionary War? Anybody know his name? Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was a freed slave who had become a whaler for the merchant marines. He heard an alarm go off on his ship. He ran up deck to put out the fire, because that's usually what an alarm meant, only to find out that there was no fire, but that his own government had picked up arms against his own people. He was witnessing the very beginning of the Boston Massacre. Crispus Attucks ran back below deck, got 55 of his shipmates, came out, and gave his life so that you and I could sit in this room today, say a prayer, and even criticize our government and not worry about stormtroopers coming through the door to arrest us, or even worse. There was a poem written about Crispus Attucks in his day. Honor to Crispus Attucks, who was leader and voice that day, the first to defy and the first to die, with maverick car in gray. Call it riots or revolution, his hand first clenched at the crown. His feet were the first in perilous place to pull the king's flag down. His breast was the first one rent apart, that liberty's stream might flow. For our freedom now and forever, his head was first laid low. Call it riot or revolution, or mob or crowd as you may, such deaths have been seed of nations, such lives shall be honored forever. Raise your hand if this is the first time you've ever heard of Crispus Attucks. Keep it up. I want you to look around. Does it look like we're honoring addicts forever? All right, put your hand down. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of a man named Ned Hector. Ned Hector was another freed slave who fought in the battles of Brandywine and Germantown. When his unit was given the order to retreat, he refused. He said, "The enemy shall not have my team. I will perish. I will save the horses or perish myself." He would end up getting an award, a Medal of Honor from George Washington. You see, the truth of the matter is, there were battalions of freed slaves that fought in our Revolutionary War. The states had provisions that said if you are a slave and you want to fight in the name of liberty against the tyrannical king, you will be a free man forever. But I don't think we think about that anymore. We certainly don't teach it. But if we really, really thought about that, we would understand that there are some men who gave their only free breath so that we could sit in this room today and say a prayer and associate with right-wing fringe groups and criticize the government and be pro-life if we choose and believe in conservative limited government if we choose and not worry about stormtroopers coming through that door. But we don't teach that anymore. We would rather teach a lie that the Constitution was written by a bunch of rich white guys who hated everybody but themselves and their money, because that's how we keep segments of our population in servitude and the people of our country hating the most amazing human rights document that has ever been written in this world. I hear lots of things about the Constitution as I go around and defend it. One man said to me, "How can you defend the Constitution when it made black people 3/5 of a person?" You see, these are the things that we teach in our schools, but they're absolute lies. You see, our Constitution, and our framers said it over and over again, was a cutting-edge document to end slavery. But we don't teach that truth anymore because we've got too many lies to hold up. So we have this idea that the principles in our Constitution were invented in 1776, as if the framers woke up on July 3rd, ticked off at the king and said, "Hey, I've had enough of this stuff. Why don't you call Tom up and see if he can put together a document and we'll send it over to the king and be done with all of this." This idea that the Constitution was written in 1787, all to teach you that it's outdated and irrelevant, because after all, what would the framers possibly know about Facebook and Twitter and the blogosphere, right? Can we remember that it wasn't too long ago when Dick Durbin said on Fox, I think it was, or maybe it was one of the other mainstream medias, I'm not sure, they all blend together after a while, said, "Hey, what is a journalist? We know Fox, we know AP, we know they're journalists." He says, "But are tweeters journalists? Are bloggers journalists?" He said, "We need to ask 21st century questions about a document that was written over 200 years ago." See, I don't have to call people names. They classify their own ignorance with their own words. My simple response to him was, "Hey, Dick, it's the First Amendment. I don't need to be government approved. That's the whole point." So we got to know something about our Constitution. We got to know some things. Patrick Henry said, "I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know no way to judge the future but by the past." Alexander Hamilton said, "Experience is the oracle of truth, and where its responses are unequivocal, they ought to be held to be sacred and conclusive." How many of you have heard this saying, "Those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it"? That's what we're taught, but that's not true. Did Didn't you hear just Patrick Henry just say, the only way I know your future is by my past? Ever heard of a guy named Solomon? Said there's nothing new under the sun. You see, history always repeats itself. Human nature never changes. But those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. And repeating is exactly what we're doing. You see, in 1776, we were British citizens. Yes, even Thomas Paine admitted that we were the melting pot, people coming from all over the globe. But the minute you stepped foot in the British colonies, you became subject to British law. And the minute you built a house, you became the resident of a colony ruled by Great Britain. Just like if you guys were to go to Oklahoma, right? Once you drive into Oklahoma, are you not subject to Oklahoma law? Right? If you move your house and go to Oklahoma, you're no longer a resident of Texas, but you are now a resident of Oklahoma, right? The exact same thing in 1776. So prior to our independence, everyone who lived in the colonies were British citizens subject to British law. And that is where our Constitution comes from. That is the heritage of our Constitution. You see, it was not invented in 1776. It was not written in 1787. It took 700 years to write our Constitution. 5 fundamental documents written over those 700 years before our Declaration of Independence could even be penned. Our Constitution and our Bill of Rights all coming from that. We didn't invent anything. We inherited it all. And once you know that history, you'll figure out Thomas Jefferson didn't write the Declaration of Independence. He plagiarized it. And so very briefly, I'm going to give you this history so you just understand how important religious liberty is. For our birth of religious liberty, I'm going to take you to 1045. 1045, Great Britain is still a kingdom just like it was in 1776. Now there are some fundamental civics that we simply don't teach anymore. Right? What's the difference between a kingdom and a republic? In a kingdom, the king holds all the power and hands out the rights as he sees fit. So when you live in a kingdom, you literally wake up every single day wondering what you can and cannot do. Because when you live in a kingdom, you are subject to what they call the whim of the sovereign. Ever heard that saying, isn't it great to be king? It's great to be king because whatever you want in that minute and that day and that hour is yours.
I think we got a king.
Yeah. I'm not done yet. So you see, in a kingdom, the king holds all the power and hands out all the rights and privileges as he wants. And now let me ask you something. If the king gives the rights, what else can he do? Take them away. The republic, completely other end of the spectrum. In a republic, the people hold all the rights and delegate power to the government as they see fit. And if we can delegate the power, what can we do?
Take it away.
Take it away. Now, how many of you have heard people call our government a democracy? Okay? I hope you understand that we are not a democracy. I've heard people call us a democratic republic. I'm not quite sure what that is. You might find that in the dictionary right next to dry water. Because it is a contradiction in terms. But you see, I think that if we really understood the difference between a democracy and a republic, we would not simply allow our politicians the slip of the tongue. Oh, well, you know what I really mean. Because it's not simply a slip of the tongue. Ever heard if you repeat a lie long enough, it becomes the truth? We are raising generations of people that think that a republic and a democracy are synonymous, and they absolutely are not. Now remember, there's a big difference between a kingdom and a republic, right? Kingdom, the king holds all the power, hands out the rights as he sees fit, has the power to take them away as he sees fit. In a republic, the people hold all the rights and delegate power to government. Can't get any more different. But the truth of the matter is, there is really no difference between a democracy and a kingdom. The only difference between a democracy and a kingdom is how many people hold all the rights. You see, in a democracy, the majority holds all the rights and hands them out as they see fit. And if the majority has the right to hand them out, they have the right to take them away. Now, it's sort of frustrating to me when I hear, even in our society, this slip of the tongue is more prevalent in our minority groups than in other groups. Because I'm thinking, if I'm a minority, I'm going to make sure we stay a republic. Because in a democracy, the minority is always subject to the majority rule. And you never get any rights, you never get any privileges unless the majority says so. Do you know how I know we're not a democracy? If we had been a democracy, the civil rights movement would have failed. If we had been a democracy, there would have been no women's suffrage movement. Because in a democracy, the minority never has any voice. Only in a constitutional republic can a minority have a society-changing voice. And I'm thinking if we really, really grasped that, we would understand that this whole slip of the tongue is more than just a slip of a tongue. It's an insidious mechanism to transform this country into something that it is not. Because the funny thing is, when you are a democracy, the mob holds all the power, but tyrants know how to control the mob. That's why people who do not love liberty and people who want to control people like democracies, because they know they can control them with good things promised. So in 1045, Great Britain is a kingdom. But it is a unique kingdom. Because unlike other kingdoms, Great Britain has common law. It's a common set of laws based on common social standards, commonly known by all, and in theory, commonly applied on all classes of people. How many of you think it worked out that way? No, did not, but that was the idea. And so even though the king could do whatever he wanted in Great Britain, because of common law, there were some things he could not do. So every day you wake up in a kingdom, you wonder what's right and what's wrong, because it could change from day to day, from hour to hour, except in Great Britain, because of common law, some things were always right and some things were always wrong. This is called a limited monarchy. In 1045, the king's name is Edward the Confessor. He is recorded in history as being a generous king, but he's not going to have any sons. And so when he's about to die, they have to go and find a new king, and every kingdom has a list of who gets to be next. The top name on that list is a man named William I. Now, William I knows he's supposed to be king. He's talked to Edward about it. Problem is, William is not from Great Britain. William lives in Normandy. And the people of Great Britain do not want a Norman king. Because you see, if you get a foreign king, you never know what you're going to get. So, they hatch out this plan to appoint a man named Harold to be king of Great Britain. Problem is, the year is 1065, and kings are not appointed, kings are not elected. They're still on the throne by the principle of divine right, which says God himself puts men on the throne by birthing them in the right family, in the right birth order. William gets wind that he's being passed over as king and completely passed out of his bloodline. He's not happy. Bad news is this. William has a nickname. He's called William the Conqueror. What do you suppose happens when you make a guy mad whose nickname is the Conqueror? He conquers. He raises his Norman army. He goes over to Great Britain and defeats Harold and the English people setting himself up on the throne. He is fully aware of the whim of the sovereign, ready to be king, to do whatever he wants. Only he gets to Great Britain and figures out that they're a unique kingdom. And this common law says he can't do whatever he wants. This makes him very unhappy. William is going to set about to fundamentally transform Great Britain. Now, the first thing William does to fundamentally transform this unique kingdom is try to destroy the thing that makes it unique, this common law. He starts replacing the judges in the common law system with judges who are not loyal to the common law, but loyal to the ideology of the king. He starts using those judges to enforce his foreign law on the people of Great Britain, contrary to their common law. He starts replacing the leadership in the churches with men who are not loyal to the Word of God, but loyal to the ideology of the king and willing to do whatever the king asks, even when it's contrary to God's Word. Because he's going to use the churches to enforce his tyrannical laws and collect his arbitrary taxes. He starts running the landowners off of their land with threats and force itself, completely running some of them out of the kingdom, and then taking their abandoned land into his possession and handing it over to his foreign friends. How else do you keep foreign law in a kingdom if it's not full of people who like the foreign law better than the common law of the land? This goes on for 40 years, and William's had 4 sons. He and his first son don't get along. His first son tries to murder him and flees the kingdom when he fails. His second son is killed in an accident, leaving his 2 younger sons heirs to the throne, William II and Henry I. William II takes the throne, and history records that William II is a wicked, evil king. William II is going to rule for a short while until one day, William II and his little brother Henry decided to go hunting together. And William II is killed in a mysterious hunting accident when a stray arrow from Henry's hunting party accidentally kills William, coincidentally catapulting Henry to the throne. You think this was an accident? Well, neither did the people of Great Britain. And they were not accepting Henry as king. Now, when you don't accept someone as king, you don't start a recall petition. You don't get a candidate to run against them at the next election. When you live in a kingdom, your only option is revolution and to start chopping off heads. Kings know this. Henry is fond of his head. So he starts making promises to the people. Promise number 1, I'm going to marry an Anglo-Saxon woman. Now, the Anglo-Saxons are the majority of the population in Great Britain, and Henry and his advisors have figured out that they can pacify the majority of the population with the expectation of things they're going to get from the government. Right? Because if you're Anglo-Saxon and there's an Anglo-Saxon queen, you know that she's going to favor your people. The second thing Henry does is he promises to do an investigation of the murder of his brother. I'm going to determine whether I murdered my brother or not. How do you think that's going to work out when the government investigates itself, right? The Department of Justice investigating Eric Holder or whatever, right? Same thing, Henry's not at fault for the death of his brother, and he is fit to be king. The people didn't believe this investigation any more than you or I do. Henry makes a final promise, the most important one. Remember I told you there were 5 documents? Henry signs the first one. It's called the 1100 Charter of Liberties, and it declares that kings will no longer be evil and oppressive. Ever again. He makes a list of 14 things that kings can no longer do, because if they do them, they'll be evil and oppressive. It's a really amazing list, actually. One of them says, if any of my baron or earls shall die, his heirs shall not be forced to purchase their inheritance, but shall retrieve it through force of law and custom. Because apparently Henry, who's a king, no obligation to the people whatsoever, recognizes that when the government requires you to purchase your inheritance from them before you receive it, that's the mark of an evil and oppressive government. Wait a minute. Isn't that what inheritance tax is? How is it that Henry I called that evil and oppressive and our government calls it revenue? Well, Henry makes this promise and the people are going to need it. Because 100 years later, the most evil king that Great Britain will ever know is going to be on the throne. His name is John. John is a massive taxation king, and if you cannot pay your taxes in John's kingdom, you are arrested, you are thrown into prison, you are mutilated. Hands, feet, ears, tongues cut out because you can't pay your taxes. They called him ruthless and vicious. You guys know John, by the way. You probably don't realize it. Ever heard of a guy named Robin Hood? That's the king in the Robin Hood story. Somebody shout out to me, what is Robin Hood's claim to fame? Rob from the rich and give to the poor. That's what we're taught, but that's not true. Robin Hood was not engaged in redistribution of wealth. Robin Hood was not taking from the rich and giving to the poor. Robin Hood was taking from the king and the crown the money that had been stolen from the people through oppressive taxation and returning it to the people so they could live. He's not trying to put everybody on equal financial footing. He's giving people their lives back.
Amen.
He's a liberty fighter, not a socialist. But you see, the bad news is this, and I really want you to pay attention to this because history proves this. John, his murdering people for not paying their taxes was not enough to bring a revolution. Because when societies are only focused on prosperity, only focused on what they have in their hand or what they can get, balanced budgets or job numbers, tyrants, and history proves this, tyrants will always be able to trickle down just enough to make you happy slaves. Good news is, tyrants always commit a fundamental error. They get power drunk and they start thinking they can do anything to the people and the people will do nothing. John commits the fundamental error because the people of Great Britain have chosen a man named Stephen Langton to be the archbishop of their church. John steps up and says, I don't like this guy. I'm going to pick who the head of your church is going to be. But John's forgotten about the 1100 Charter of Liberties because the very first promise Henry makes in the 1100 Charter of Liberties is that the church will be wholly free from government intrusion. Does that sound familiar? That, my friends, is separation of church and state. That the government has no business in your church. It never meant God has no business in your government. Thomas Jefferson did not invent separation of church and state. He took it from Henry I. But you know that to be the first part of our First Amendment, right? Well, I'm going to give you a pop quiz. And I don't want you to answer out loud. I don't want you to open up your pocket constitution, use your smartphone or your tablet. I don't want you to ask your neighbor, and I don't want you to call for a lifeline. Okay? I don't even want you to lip sync the answer because it's really, really important for what we're doing here today for your neighbor to know whether he knows the answer to this question or not. So we talked about the First Amendment. But there are 5 individual liberties in the First Amendment alone. Name all 5. We have a Supreme Court justice in Florida who took this poll, found out that only 2% of the people asked could name all 5. Now, I don't know where you fall in that spectrum on those statistics. That's not my concern, that's yours. But I asked you that question just so I could ask you this one. If you do not know what your rights are, how do you know they're not already gone? Because the Bill of Rights does not protect your rights. We talk about constitutionally protected rights. The Constitution is a piece of parchment with ink on it. It can't do anything to protect your rights. Can the Bill of Rights pick up a pen and write your congressman a letter? Can the Bill of Rights go sit in your senator's office and demand compliance? Can the Bill of Rights pick up a sword? The only defenders of liberty exist in your seat. But if you don't know what they are, you cannot defend them. If you cannot define them, you cannot defend them. And we are in a sad, sad state in America when people don't even know what their rights are. Think to yourself right now. Recite to yourself the Ninth Amendment. The Ninth Amendment is the most important text in the entire Constitution and Bill of Rights. The most important piece of words in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights put together. The Ninth Amendment is the one thing that declares us a republic and not a kingdom. It declares that all the rights in the universe belong to the people. And the government cannot deny them, nor can they disparage them, because they all belong to us. The most neglected amendment in the entire Constitution, because it's the most important. Don't tell me there's not a design in this. A revolution is brought against John, bringing us the second document in the genealogy of our Constitution, the Magna Carta of 1215. The Magna Carta is an amazing document. Henry I, a king, wrote the 1100 Charter of Liberties, but the Magna Carta is going to be penned by the people, the barons and lords, technically, but they are still subjects of the king. No rights, no privileges unless the king grants them. But the Magna Carta is the people standing up to the king and saying, you made a promise to us in 1100 that kings would no longer be evil and oppressive. You obviously have no idea how to keep that promise. So now we, the people, are going to rise in our majesty above the king and tell you what you can and cannot do, so you'll keep that promise. No taxation without representation, and then creates a committee of 25 men with the power and the authority sitting right there in the king's court to look at the king and say, no, you can't do that because it breaks your promise. Clauses 39 and 40 of the Magna Carta are our due process. Our 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Amendments all come from that. We didn't invent them, we inherited them. Clause 61 of the Magna Carta declared the rights of the people to petition the government of their grievances. That should sound familiar too. That's that 5th aspect of the First Amendment we always seem to forget. So let me make it easy for you, right? Because that was the right to petition the government of your grievances. We forget that. That's way too many words. So you have freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, the freedom to assemble, and the freedom to complain. There you are. There's your 5. John signs the Magna Carta because he's got a sword at his throat. And the people are going to remove him from the throne a year later. But setting up a system where the people can tell the king what he can and cannot do is not going to be a popular one. And the people are now going to have to fight for 400 years to maintain that control. The year is now 1625. The king is Charles I. Charles is a massive spending king. They complain that Charles likes to romp about Europe, spending on his every whim and fancy. I'm not quite sure if they played golf back then, but whose money was he spending? The people's. How was he collecting their money? Taxes. Parliament, which is those 25 men now, get tired of Charles' wasteful spending, stand up to him and say, we're not passing any more of your taxes until you get your spending under control. Charles says, fine, but I'll remind you something, I'm king. Why do I even need Parliament? And he dissolves Parliament. Perhaps he said, where Parliament refuses to legislate, I'll just go ahead and regulate. Or maybe he held a State of the Kingdom address and said, if Parliament won't pass laws, I will. Because declaring them irrelevant and impotent is the same as dismissing them altogether. But you see, Charles can't pass a tax now because you can't be too tyrannical too fast. But he remembers as a king he has the power of decree. So he issues a decree to collect the people's money, but he's careful not to call it a tax. He calls it a forced loan. 7 knights stand up to Charles and say, tax, mandate tax. We don't care what you call this. This is taxation without representation, and we will not enforce this law, and we will not comply. Charles throws them in prison and denies them their due process, and they die there. But a revolution is born, bringing the third document in the genealogy of our Constitution, the Petition of Right of 1628. The Petition of Right is another list of grievances and says there'll be no taxation without representation regardless of what you call it. Yes, we do have the right to due process, and while we're at it, we're going to add a couple more. You cannot invoke martial law on us unless we're being invaded by a foreign nation, and you cannot quarter soldiers in our homes without our permission, because we didn't invent the Third Amendment either. We inherited it. Charles signs the Petition of Right the same way John did, with a sword at his throat, but the people don't remove him. They allow him to remain king. Charles goes on with his spending, only now he comes up with an excuse. Because the years between 1628 and 1641 are very violent times in Europe, and Charles starts collecting the money from the people, saying, I need your tax dollars, because we've got to fund our allies in these foreign wars. If we don't fund our allies in these foreign wars, the enemies will come after us. Only the people are watching Charles and noticing he's not actually funding their allies. He's funding their enemies. Charles is brought up on charges of treason, found guilty, and sentenced to death. The process that brings us the fourth document in the genealogy of our Constitution, called the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. The Grand Remonstrance is another list of grievances, and it says, the root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design to subvert the fundamental laws and liberties of our kingdom. They said, look, we've been watching tyrants now for 600 years, and we're noticing a pattern. They're using the same bag of tricks over and over and over again. And then they identify those tricks in this document through a list of grievances. Corruption of the court system, infiltration of foreign law, diminishing property rights of the people, the government controlling the churches, the creation of a fiat monetary system to take them off the gold and silver standard, and disarming the people while the government remained armed. The wicked evil plan identified in 1641. Because if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat its mistakes. This is not the last time they fight. 40 years later, they have a new king named James II. James II is going the same way as all the other kings, only James has figured out if you're going to steal their liberty, you've got to give them something to distract them. So James issues a decree and says, I'm going to give you something that you've never had before. It's called religious liberty. This religious liberty decree says you no longer have to be a member of the Church of England. You can have church anywhere you want, with any pastor you want. You can preach anything you want, and you can meet with any people you want. Religious liberty. Except the decree did not end there. Because the decree said you can have all those things, but before you have church, you must let the king know where you're meeting, who will be preaching, what will be said, who are you meeting with, and you must promise that you will never, ever, ever say anything that might even be construed as criticism of the king. That doesn't sound like religious liberty to me. That sounds like a 501c3. James then demands that the bishops read this decree in their churches, and 7 bishops stand up to James and say, wait a minute, we have a promise 500 years old that says the church will be wholly free from government intrusion. We're not reading anything. James arrests them, throws them in prison, and charges them with the crime of seditious libel. Seditious libel is that aspect of the decree that says you can't criticize the king. Now James has learned from Charles, you got to give them their due process or they'll chop off your head. So in this seditious libel decree, you get your day in court, but James has nothing to worry about because seditious libel is written in such a way that truth is no defense. So even if you're correct in your criticism of the king, you have to die because you can't criticize the king. 7 bishops got their day in court. 7 bishops who should have been sentenced to a death sentence were acquitted because 2 judges refused to enforce an unconstitutional decree, and for the rest of them, the jury of their peers refused to find them guilty of an unconstitutional crime. Because we didn't invent the trial by jury, nor jury nullification. We inherited them both. A revolution is brought against James, bringing us the 5th document in the genealogy of our Constitution, the English Bill of Rights of 1689. This English Bill of Rights of 1689 was the very extension of the constitutional charter over those 700 years that our framers brought to this country. It says, the late King James II, by the assistance of evil judges, counselors, and ministers employed by him, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the religion and liberties of this kingdom. Now that word extirpate means to completely destroy. And that's a pretty strong word. And they said James was completely destroying liberty by writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law when that was the sole privilege of the legislative branch. Because you see, we did not invent separation of powers, we inherited them. And apparently in 1689, they knew that when the executive branch writes laws, sets aside laws, and eliminates laws, when that's the job of the legislative branch, that's the complete destruction of liberty. But apparently our Congress hasn't picked up the fact that executive orders are the exact same thing. So when it came time to create our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, our Declaration of Independence, we didn't have to invent anything. It was already there. How many of you remember being taught that the Pilgrims came to this continent looking for religious liberty? Raise your hand. That's what we're taught, but that's not true. They were not coming here searching for religious liberty. They were coming here fleeing religious persecution. There is a big difference. Because when they came here, it was under the charter of the king, still swearing allegiance to the king. That's how the colonies remained property of the Crown of Great Britain. And in that, each of those charters set up their own governments. And within those governments, they set up the religion of that charter. The only religion that was lawful. So if you came to the new colonies fleeing religious persecution, and you ended up in a chartered colony that was not your religion, you stopped practicing your religion, or you went to prison. Because it was not simply unwanted, it was illegal. They had these provisions in the charters called test acts that said, if you want to be in government, you must take an oath of loyalty to the chartered religion. Now, before we start kicking them too badly, let's remember that liberty, although inherent, is not a natural tendency for people. The natural tendency for people is to want to be ruled. Remember the Israelites? God said to them, I will be your king. I will be your provider. I will be your savior and your supplier. You don't have to worry about everything. I know what you need before you even ask. The Israelites rebelled against God and said, no, we want a man king like everyone else. Liberty is an inherent gift, but it's not a natural tendency. And so this understanding of liberty is something that we had to acquire through hard, blood-bought lessons. But in their mind, we're fleeing religious persecution, and we can make this charter our religion. The government will enforce our religion, and we will never be persecuted by our government again. Because we'll make sure that everybody in government takes an oath of loyalty to our religion, and then our government will always be us. Problem is, politicians don't always tell the truth. Now, I'm not saying they do it all out of malicious evil intent, but imagine this. Because when you're fleeing religious persecution, you don't buy an airplane ticket, hop on a plane in Heathrow, and pick which airport you're going to land in the new colonies. You are literally fleeing. You are quite often bankrupting yourself to buy a ticket, to get on a boat, and then praying that you live through the journey and you end up where you end up. So what happens if you end up and your people end up in a charter that's not your religion? Do you simply stop worshiping God? No. Maybe you can justify taking an oath that you don't believe in so you can get into the government and change that chartered religion to your own, so now the government cannot persecute you anymore. They'll just persecute everybody else. Doesn't that make sense? Because you see, we often forget that the sword the government wields to protect us can very quickly become the sword that persecutes us. Not only that, maybe you don't want to take an oath that's a lie. Do you just stop worshiping God? Do you stop having church? Because this is the dilemma that these pilgrims really had. There was a man by the name of Obadiah Holmes. Obadiah Holmes was a preacher for the Baptist separatists, fleeing persecution in Europe as well. They ended up in a charter that was not their religion, but they continued to have church. I don't know if any of you know Baptist preachers. I'm married to one. You don't shut them up, okay? Doesn't happen. So Obadiah Holmes and his people continue to have church, but they do it in secret in each other's homes. Until one day somebody knocks on the door and turns them in. The constable says to Obadiah Holmes, "Are you preaching outside the chartered religion?" He says, "Yes, I am." He was immediately arrested, thrown into prison, and beaten so severely that he had to spend an entire week on his hands and knees because there was no other way to be relieved from the pain. Because you see, that happened on this soil. On the new colonies, men and women were fined and arrested and persecuted, tarred, feathered, tortured, even killed for their religious beliefs. We're not talking about Iraq. We're not talking about China. We're talking about the foundation of the colonies that would become the United States. So when it came time to create the more perfect union, there was a group in the state of Virginia called the Virginia Baptist General Convention. And the Virginia Baptist General Convention was the political power in Virginia. Oh my goodness, Christians being political, heresy. But you see, the Virginia Baptist General Convention, controlling the state of Virginia, was refusing to ratify the Constitution without greater protections of religious liberty. Without ratification of the Constitution, the states would have devolved into 13 independent countries. We'd have been picked off like that, one by the very countries that helped us gain our independence. France, Spain, Holland, all still occupying us in some way or another. We were in great debt to these countries. And if we hadn't formed a union, a voice saying we are 13, but we are one in defense of each other, we would have become little Spain, little France, little Holland, and maybe even little piece of Great Britain once all the negotiation was over. The state of Virginia was saying we would rather lose everything that we focused, that we sacrificed life, fortune, and sacred honor to get. Because if we don't have religious liberty, we don't have anything. The leader of the Virginia Baptist General Convention was a man named John Leland. John Leland did not want to be a politician anymore, But the Virginia Baptist General Convention wanted him to be the delegate for the state of Virginia. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of John Leland. John Leland didn't want to be the delegate, so he met with his opponent. Now everybody knew that the Virginia Baptist General Convention was the power in Virginia, and that Leland would be the delegate. So John Leland met with his opponent and made a deal. And said, I'll back out of this race. I will endorse you. You know that will guarantee you this seat to be the delegate for the state of Virginia. But you must promise that you will do everything humanly and superhumanly possible to make sure that we have greater protection of religious liberty. His opponent agreed. You know his opponent, by the way. His name is James Madison. James Madison agreed with John Leland to ensure that there would be greater protection of religious liberty. And it's because James Madison honored that promise that we have a First Amendment and we have a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was not an afterthought. I actually debated a liberal professor at the University of Miami School of Law on the interpretation of the Constitution under original intent. And I learned, because I didn't know back then, that the liberals think that the Bill of Rights was an afterthought. Oops, we forgot something. We didn't get it all right. Let's hurry, get back together, and throw some stuff in there. The Bill of Rights was not an afterthought. The Bill of Rights was a condition of ratification of the Constitution. Because if Virginia had failed to ratify, they wouldn't have had the number of states to make a union, and there would have been no union. So we have this now. What does separation of church and state mean? Because I know you've all heard that, and you're inevitably going to hear somebody say, well, that's just something that Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter. That's not even in the Constitution. Well, that's maybe what you heard, but the truth of the matter is, Thomas Jefferson, you know now, did not invent separation of church and state. He took it from Henry I. Separation of church and state is in the Constitution. It says, Congress shall make no law establishing a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That is our framers' rendition of the church will be wholly free from government intrusion.
Right.
But because we don't know our history, and we don't even know why Thomas Jefferson wrote that letter, we don't understand what that means. Thomas Jefferson did not wake up one morning with a random thought, let's sit down and write the Danbury Baptists a letter today. Thomas Jefferson was responding to a letter that the Danbury Baptists had written to him. The Danbury Baptists wrote Thomas Jefferson a letter right after he was elected president, encouraging him. We're so glad you're president, because they helped him get elected. But we just want to make sure, now that you're president, that you still believe the same things that you said you believed when we helped you run. We appreciate, they said, the stand that you took in defense of religious liberty, and we just want to make sure you are still on board. Thomas Jefferson replied, "It is with sovereign reverence that I contemplate that act of the whole American people which declared that Congress shall make no law establishing a religion or prohibiting their free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between the church and the state." He said, I may be president, but I also recognize that I am one man, and it was not me who ratified the Constitution, it was the whole American people, and who am I to overturn what a whole American people said? What was that stand that Thomas Jefferson took for religious liberty? But we don't teach that history either. Shortly after we ratified the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, a group of legislators got together to pass a bill called the Payment of Christian Teachers with Tax Dollars. They were going to collect tax dollars and pay the Christian teachers. Thomas Jefferson was vehemently opposed to this legislation, and so were the Baptists. Why? Why? Thomas Jefferson said to force someone to pay for something that they do not believe in is sinful and tyrannical. Because Richard Henry Lee said, although we are not disposed to differ much about religion now, why not make religious liberty a part of that national compact? Not disposed to differ much. They were pretty much all Christians, but not completely. And Thomas Jefferson says if you force the non-Christians to pay for the Christian teachers through the taxation, that is sinful and tyrannical. And the Danbury Baptist said, it is believed to be repugnant to the spirit of the gospel for the legislature thus to proceed in matters of religion. Repugnant, that's a strong word, isn't it? Repugnant to the spirit of the gospel to pay Christian teachers with tax dollars. How is that possible? Well, very loosely, the spirit of the gospel is this. Through the fall of Adam, man inherited a sinful nature which created a chasm between God and man that man himself could not reconcile. So God sent his only begotten Son to be the perfect sinless sacrifice, a reconciliation between man and God that could not be completed by man, only by God himself. And because of that sinless sacrifice of Christ on the cross, we now have faith in Christ alone to get eternal salvation. Not what man has done, but what Christ did. The spirit of the gospel is very simply, God is sufficient for eternal salvation. So how is it that the payment of Christian teachers through tax dollars is repugnant to that spirit? Well, it's the same thing that Jesus said to Nicodemus. If I teach you of earthly things and you believe me not, how will you ever believe me in the heavenly? Because see, Christians, and I'm just addressing Christians right now, are you not told to raise your children in the love and admonition of the Lord? Are you not told to raise your children in the way that they should go so they will not depart from it? And if you know your Bible, you know the Bible also teaches that you are to educate, to teach your children separate from the heathen. Now God said in Matthew chapter 6 that God so clothed the grass in the field, which is here today and gone tomorrow. The sparrow does not work, he does not toil, he does not labor, but yet he still has something to eat. And the lilies in the valley, are Solomon in all his array was never dressed as well as the lilies in the valley. How much more would your Father in heaven provide for you? It then goes on to say that when you worry about what you're going to wear and what you're going to eat and how you're going to live, you look like what the Gentiles look like. Who were the Gentiles in that day? The non-believers. God is saying, when you worry about how you're going to provide for the things that I'm supposed to provide for you, you look like an unbeliever. I don't even recognize you as my child. Therefore, think not on what you shall wear and what you shall eat and how you shall live, because your Father in heaven knows what you need before you even ask. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. So if God tells us that we're supposed to raise our children in the love and admonition of the Lord, then we as Christians should know that we can rely on him by faith to pay for that. But when we run to the government as Christians to ask the government to pay for our Christian schools and our Christian teachers, what we're proclaiming to a lost and dying world is that God is insufficient to meet our earthly needs and he needs a government bailout. Which means what you're telling the world of non-believers is that God is insufficient to provide for your earthly needs. So when you bring them the gospel, how can they ever believe you that God will be sufficient for their heavenly needs? This is why, Christians, we are called hypocrites. The Baptist went on to say, should the legislature assume the right of taxing the people for the support of the gospel, it will be destructive to religious liberty. How would paying Christian teachers with tax dollars destroy religious liberty? Because you're paying the Christian teachers to teach the Christian gospel, and you're prolonging the Christian religion, right? Wrong. Because you see, what they knew was, whom the government employs in its service, it has the right to regulate and dictate to. And it will not be long before they will judge and determine who shall preach, when and where, and what they shall preach. Because when the government pays someone, they don't become employees of the people. Your school teachers don't call themselves employees of the people. They call themselves state employees. The IRS does not refer to themselves as employees of the citizens of the United States. They refer to themselves as. And where the government spends your tax dollars, they have the right and duty to regulate. And you cannot pay a Christian teacher to teach that Jesus is the only way to heaven when part of that money is coming from a Muslim. Because then what happens is you have to pay Muslim teachers to teach that all Christians who do not convert must be beheaded. Does that sound like something you want your tax dollars spent on? Or perhaps you want to pay Luciferian teachers the right to teach that Satan is the true God in heaven and that we need to bow in allegiance to him. Because when you pay Christian teachers with tax dollars, that's exactly what has to happen, because the government cannot discriminate by faith in its practices, because once it says we will pay this religion and not that religion, what is it doing? It's establishing religion. That's why you can't let vouchers as Christians. You cannot accept vouchers. Vouchers are the payment of Christian teachers with tax dollars. They will turn all of your Christian schools into government-controlled schools. It is repugnant to the spirit of the gospel, and you will destroy school choice.
That's right.
People say, Kris Anne, we can't stop vouchers. You're against school choice. No, I'm not. I'm trying to save it. We do not lack school choice in this country. Because you can send your child to a private school. You can send your child to a government school. You can homeschool your child if you want. We do not live in Germany where you go to prison for homeschooling your children. We do not lack school choice. We lack parental priorities.
That's right. That's right.
We have too many parents who think that flat screen TVs in every room, cell phones in every hand, having a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in an affluent neighborhood with a 2-car garage and 3 cars in the driveway, and a vacation every year, because you forgot that commandment, right? Thou shalt have a vacation every year. And who likes to cook at home every night? Those things to our Christian parents are become more and more important than living by faith and raising our children in the love and admonition of the Lord. And what do we get? What do we get? We send our children to Christian schools to get an education and learn to love God. So why are we so surprised that when we send our children to government schools, they get an education and learn to love government?
That's right. That's right.
Can I let you in on a secret? The government schools cannot teach Christianity.
Right.
They cannot. Because the minute they do, they have to teach every other religion. You have to let them pray to Christ, you have to let them pray to Allah, you have to let them pray to Satan, and everybody gets their way.
That's right.
If you want your child to be raised as a Christian, then you cannot send them to a government school. And that just makes people way too mad, and I'm sorry, but the truth hurts. Now, you want your community schools to reflect the communities? Then kick the state out of your school and the federal government out of your state. I find it quite ironic that you refer to your schools as independent school districts, because I don't really see much independence in them.
That's right. That's right.
What is wrong? I'll tell you what's wrong. The fate of this nation is going to fall at the feet of our churches. You see, do you believe that the liberty is a gift from God? I'm going to ask you, do you believe liberty is a gift from God?
Yes.
Do you believe that in the very least this country was founded on the direct providence and the graceful hand of God?
Yes.
Then as Christians you have a greater obligation than everyone else. The parable of the talents teaches us this. Are you ready? She's going to read the Bible. Hold on. For the kingdom of heaven is a man traveling into a far country, who called his own servant and delivered unto them his goods. And unto one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to every man according to his several abilities, and straightway he took his journey. Then he that received the 5 talents went and traded with the same, and made them other 5 talents. And likewise he that received 2, he also gained another 2. But he that received 1 went and digged in the earth, and hid his Lord's money. And after a long time, the Lord of the servants cometh and reckoneth with him. If you believe that liberty is a gift from God, you know that your Lord and Master is returning, and there will be a day of reckoning.
Amen. Amen.
And so he that had received the 5 talents came and brought another 5 talents, saying, Lord, thou deliverest unto me 5 talents. Behold, I have gained beside them 5 talents more. His Lord said unto him, Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. Now the one that had received 2 had the same scenario. But he that received the 1 talent came and said to the Lord, I knew that thee art an hard man, reaping where thou hast not sown, and gathering where thou hast not strawed. And I was afraid. I went and hid thy talent in the earth, and lo, that is thine. His Lord answered and said unto him, Thou wicked and slothful servant, thou knewest that I reap where I sowed not, and gathered where I have not strawed. Thou oughtest therefore to have put my money to the exchangers, and then at my coming I should have received my own with usury. Take therefore that talent from him, and give unto him which hath 10 talents. For unto every one that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. As a Christian, you know there is a day of reckoning coming. And if you believe that liberty is a gift from God, you have an obligation in obedience to that master to prosper that gift. But if you do nothing to defend liberty, because you know only 40% of church-going Christians are registered to vote. And of those 40% registered to vote, only 40% of those actually vote, which means only 25% of church-going Christians actually vote. We are not a reflection of our government. Our government is a reflection of the people. And the whole cold hard facts are this. Those who are supposed to be reflecting morality, those who are supposed to be reflecting Christ, are not shining very brightly. But you see, if you stand before God on that day and said, that liberty that you gave me, I really enjoyed it, but I was afraid. I was afraid to say something because I might lose my job. I was afraid to say something because my friends may not like me. I was afraid to preach the truth because I might have violated my 501c3. I was afraid to preach the truth because I might have offended someone in the pew and then they'd have taken their tithe somewhere else. I was afraid to say the truth because I was afraid of ticking off the deacons' wives because everybody knows they're worse than the IRS. And God will look at you and say, wicked and slothful servant. The fate of this country will land at the feet of our churches because we are the ones that are supposed to be operating by faith and being the defenders of liberty. We are the ones that are supposed to know that when God is with us, no one can be against us. Who dare defy the army of the Lord? But we have too many pastors who have turned themselves over to idolatry, worshiping the dollar more than the God that they serve under, afraid of losing their tithe and declaring that God is no longer fearful, that man is more to be feared than God himself. And when they fear man more than they fear God, then we know the wisdom of God is not in them, right? The wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord. And if your pastor will not teach the truth, what he is telling you is that he is a wicked idolater who no longer fears the Lord, who no longer has the wisdom of God in him, and is not fit for your pulpit. So why are you sitting there? Why are you sitting there? It is time that we stand up and defend liberty.
That's right.
Because liberty is not a gift that you purchase for yourself. You did nothing to be able to sit here today. It was won by the blood of men and women who came before us.
That's right.
But the liberty that you squandered today is not yours either. Because liberty is a gift you pay forward. And the liberty that we squander belongs to the young people.
That's right.
And Winston Churchill said, "Still, if you will not fight for the right when you can easily win without bloodshed, if you will not fight when the victory is sure and not too costly, you may have to fight with all the odds against you and only a precarious chance of survival. And there may even be a worse case. You may have to fight when there is no hope, because it's better to perish than to live as a slave." You and I, in our negligence to liberty, we may never see that end, but we will condemn on future generations to purchase back a gift that was supposed to be purchased by us. And they won't do it at the ballot box. They will do it with their blood. I did not come here today to educate you. I did not come here today to entertain you. I came here today to recruit you. Because we need liberty-minded people who are willing to battle for liberty. And so I hope that you will stand in defense of the liberty that belongs to every young person in this world, because that's my motivation. 265 meetings, 22 states. I have a radio show that runs Monday through Friday, every day, and a radio show on Sundays from 4 to 6 p.m. I have a website with over 100 articles on it, krisannehall.com. You can find just about any question you can think about constitutionally about the government and their working today. I am on Facebook. I am on Twitter. We are putting together a documentary of a workshop that I teach every Saturday. A 5-hour workshop that goes through this history in detail and teaches you the truth about the Bill of Rights. I don't charge a dime for anything that I do. This is my life, my fortune, and my sacred honor. All I ask is that you support us in any way that you can, and that you remember to pray for us. Because we do not fight flesh and blood, and the enemies of liberty are not happy with what we're doing. So please pray for us. Please support us in any way you can. Please spread the message of this ministry. If you have a group that needs to hear the truth, there's no excuses, because I don't charge anything. I want to thank you for bringing me here. I want to thank you for indulging me with your time. I'm going to pray that everybody goes home safely, and God bless.